Good evening, and welcome. I'm Jennifer Rabb, and I have just the enormous privilege of serving as president of Hunter College, where the American dream continues to come true, and I'm going to ask for a round of applause for that. Tonight, together with Roosevelt House Director Harold Hoser and the Newfield family, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this proud Hunter tradition to honor legendary investigative journalist and Hunter alumnus Jack Newfield, class of 1960. And what better way to honor Jack than to host the nation's top journalist for this conversation about Jack's transformative and enduring impact on the landscape of journalism. We are gratified at Hunter to be able to trace the beginning of Jack's extraordinary career back to his days as a Hunter student, one of the brave men in our Bronx campus, when he began to realize his dream as a sports editor for the school paper, the Hunter Arrow. His dedication to news and newspapers was abundant from the beginning, often working late after class to put together the twice-weekly publication. It was also during his time as a Hunter student that he transitioned away from writing purely about sports and became deeply interested in the political reporting for which he would become famous and sometimes feared. Driven by his commitment to the civil rights movement, Jack wanted, as he declared in his memoir, quote, to write about things that mattered. So he did for the next several decades, drawing attention to the issues and policy that most profoundly impacted the lives of New Yorkers. Along the way, he forged a brand new type of reporting that would soon become known as advocacy journalism, the ethos of which is still best characterized by the now famous Jack directive, quote, the point, he said, is not to confuse objectivity with truth. It was fitting then that years later, after many years as a reporter and columnist, Jack came to me, and I can remember our lunch. He was so excited he had a proposition to teach a course at Hunter that would help to pass along his deeply held journalistic beliefs and the finer points of his craft. Needless to say, I jumped at the opportunity to bring this giant, and with his experience and his expertise, to the Hunter classroom, and we began planning a hands-on seminar that would offer aspiring journalists the chance to learn the tricks of the trade Jack knew so well. Tragically, we lost Jack much too soon, and he never had that chance to be in front of the classroom. To address what was really a terrible tragedy, we created the Jack Newfield Fellowship in Investigative Journalism, which brought the country's top advocacy journalists, reporters, and documentary filmmakers like Era Lewis, Tom Robbins, who's with us tonight, and Jack's beloved partner in crime, Wayne Barrett, who we also tragically lost too soon, and welcome his family tonight as well, to our classrooms to model Jack's secret sauce and his approach to enlisting journalism to change society. More recently, we transformed this program to teach a larger group, our students and you, our community, about how Jack's approach can make the world a better place. In this way, Jack's legacy lives on in a very large and impactful ways. These programs have thrived through the generosity of so many of you who love Jack and are with us tonight and have donated generously to this series, and of course, through our great friend, Jack's wonderful wife, Janie Eisenberg, herself a graduate of Hunter School of Social Work, class of '88, and the Newfield family, including his daughter, Rebecca, a graduate of Hunter School of Education, class of '06. Janie and Rebecca, please stand so we can all recognize you and thank you. Thank you. The demand for seats at tonight's event was so overwhelming that we moved the event to the cave from Roosevelt House to accommodate Jack's many admirers, as well as the countless fans of tonight's Newfield lecturer, a prize-winning journalist who comes out of a tradition that embraces truth over sensational headlines, facts over buzz, no matter the consequences, the same journalistic tradition as Jack. She is, hands down, one of the country's best-known and most widely respected political reporters, a best-selling author, CNN commentator, and Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times columnist, Maggie Haberman. Maggie, it's an honor and a privilege to welcome you back to Hunter since you joined us in 2008. On that memorable occasion, you and your New York Times colleague, Michael Schmidt, conversed about the earlier stages of your reporting on President Trump. And now, as a follow-up to that conversation, we welcome Maggie back to discuss her monumental, news-making, instant bestseller, Confidence Man, The Making of Donald Trump and the Breaking of America. In this definitive account, Maggie chronicles the evolution of the 45th president from budding real estate developer to TV personality to politician, tracing the development of the man, the mogul, and eventually the president. By carefully cultivating her relationship with the former president, Maggie has again and again positioned herself to break some of the biggest scoops of the Trump administration, putting her at the front lines of near nonstop bombshells. It's no wonder she has been dubbed the Trump Whisperer. The kind of dance with the subject would have been recognizable to Jack, whose morally driven, uncompromising reporting made him both feared and beloved at the same time. To speak with Maggie about her sensational new book, we couldn't be more pleased to welcome Bob Hart, a trusted veteran fixture of New York political journalism for more than 20 years. Bob is the political director of Spectrum News New York One, where he helms the station's coverage of state and local politics and writes a column for its website called Political Buzz. On weekday mornings, he can be seen with anchor Pat Kiernan delivering fresh insight and commentary. Bob also oversees production of the nightly program Inside City Hall, as well as coverage of major events like mayoral debates and the presidential convention. He is the perfect choice to lead tonight's discussion, not just because of this extensive resume, but because he is among those whom Maggie credits as a key influence, or as she likes to say, as one of her journalistic rabbis. Bob, Maggie, we're thrilled that you're here for the conversation that promises to explore, celebrate, and advance the Jack Newfield legacy. Through his tough, relentless, inexhaustible brand of journalism, Jack took the historic motto of Hunter College, his college, and made it his personal calling. That's mihi cor futuri, the care of the future is mine. So with that, I invite you to please join me in welcoming Bob Hart in conversation with our 2023 Jack Newfield Lecturer, Maggie Haberman. Thank you.
Who are all these people in our living room? I hope this means you're all going to be watching Inside City Hall tonight at 11 o'clock. You're allowed, you get a pass right now. But Maggie and I are going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then we're going to leave time for questions. There's microphones on both sides of the theater, so please politely line up, don't tackle anyone, and it should be, this conversation should fly by if it all goes to plan. So the comments about Jack I thought were really wonderful. Were Jack's fault. Maggie and I, Jack was a real mentor and inspiration to both of us, and it's just so great to be here tonight. He really could have just ignored the young people at the paper and done his whole thing, and instead he would actively seek out young reporters to mentor. And that's something for all of us to remember, whatever job we have in whatever walk of life. So I just really wanted to have an extra shout out to Jack. But on to you. I am your retribution. This is the subject of your political memo in today's New York Times. The words of former President Trump at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee. The conference, they had a conference over the weekend. His presidential campaign so far sort of has an Empire Strikes Back vibe to it. So let me ask you, I would say the #1 Trumpologist in the land. We'll dig into his origin story in your book, but I just want to get this out to take your temperature. How strong a candidate is he in the Republican presidential race? And how likely do you think it is that for the third time, he'll be the GOP nominee?
Sure. So first of all, thank you to Jennifer and to Hunter for having us. Thank you to Janie and Rebecca. And thank you in absentia to Jack, who did a ton for both of us, who, to your point about mentoring younger reporters, brought me on to a 10 Worst Judges series and an investigation of the Brooklyn surrogate system in 1998, and I learned so much from him that still applies to the work that I do and the work that I do with colleagues. So it's really, it's a huge honor to be here, and it's an honor to be here with Bob, who was also one of my mentors, and sometimes my retribution when we wrote a political column together in 2001. But it's great to be here. So to your question, he's a serious candidate. I mean, let me rephrase that. He is not behaving the way we are used to seeing a political candidate behave after declaring, in the same way that he hasn't been over many, many years. He has held 4 public events, one of which was the CPAC speech, since he declared in November. It has brought some comparisons to Fred Thompson, who, declared for president and then basically did nothing. But
Trump was president.
But Trump was president, and Trump still has a plurality, and in some polls, a majority of support in the Republican Party. We are entering a potentially very turbulent period over the next 90 days, because on one track, you're going to have potentially, 2 and maybe federal as well, indictments of a former sitting president. And if that happens, that would be the first time that's happened in this country. So that would be, it's going to be a unique and history-making moment. At the same time, who is running for president again?
Right.
And who has already shown that the things he says are taken by his supporters as calls to action and arms. And January 6, 2021 should have left no doubt in anyone's mind about how his supporters hear what he says. So that's one track. The other track is you're going to have a number of other candidates who may or may not decide to run. The main opposition to Donald Trump right now is expected to be Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, who has not yet declared if he does run. He's not likely to get in until late May, early June. He wants to let the Florida legislative session end so he can rack up what are expected to be additional accomplishments that he can point to. If it's a split field against Donald Trump, that advantages Donald Trump, and there is a scenario politically where he could get some kind of rallying effect from indictments. Remember, right after the FBI search at Mar-a-Lago, his numbers went up, and the support for him among Republicans went up. So I don't know what we're looking at, but the idea that he's gone or this is over, he's not what he was, but he's not nothing either, and I think it's just sort of important to realize we don't quite know how that plays out.
It reminds me of an athlete who maybe won the Super Bowl and everyone's wondering, can they do it again?
That's right.
Well, let's get to the beginning. Let's get to the origin story. I love the whole premise of your book, which is to understand Donald Trump, the president, you need to understand Donald Trump, the New Yorker. Real estate developer, casino magnate, football team owner, reality TV star. You spend a lot of time on the origin story of a man who is viewed as a superhero or a supervillain by most Americans, with very few holding opinion in between. So tell us about the man who literally helped create him, Fred Trump. And we should point out also that the late Wayne Barrett, Mac Barrett's father, did a lot of groundbreaking work on the front of looking at who is Fred Trump.
A couple of things on that. In the list you ticked off of the things that Trump is, media hound is, sort of should be top of that list, because that is part of how he became who he is. The work that Mac's father, Wayne, and Wayne was another giant who was incredibly helpful to younger reporters, and Wayne used to, in enormous frustration and anger watching the 2016 race, used to email me about, you should check this out, you should look at this. These third-party candidates, Roger Stone is behind it. I mean, it was like, and so it was really, he just had a very clear line on Trump. And what I was always told was that the reason that Wayne first went to look at Trump for this 1977 series that he did, Like Father, Like Son, and Anatomy of a Power Broker, was because Jack said you should look at him. And Wayne did not treat Trump like he was a clown or a joke. He treated him like a serious power player. And that is really the lens that he needs to be looked at, because even though he does all kinds of things that are cartoonish and that are, not at all commensurate with how we've ever seen a president act, he is still somebody who is all about power. And I think Jack understood that and Wayne understood that. And one of the people who also understood that I just want to take a mention of was the freelance editor on this project, Sasha Eisenberg, who by chance happened to be in New York City. He doesn't live here and is in the audience tonight, so thank you, Sasha. And so we spent a lot of time tracing, the influences on Trump, and Fred Trump is singular. I actually was just watching a Charlie Rose interview that Trump did in 1992, where he was where he was trying to minimize his father's influence, because so much of what Donald Trump has done over time is try to minimize his father's very large presence in his life. Fred Trump was, actually a self-made man. Fred Trump was everything that Trump has claimed to be, Donald Trump has claimed to be. He was the son of German immigrants. His father died when he was 12. He, along with his mother, started developing this, real estate, not empire, but, portfolio. And he started building political connections in the borough of Brooklyn. He started recognizing where sort of the patronage was and how, parcels of land were doled out and how approvals were doled out. And he forged connections that, appeared to have been very important to him. Among the relationships that he forged was Abe Beame, the mayor of New York City. And so Fred Trump was Donald Trump's guide, basically, through power, or one of them, anyway. But he was very stern, he was very cold, he was very brusque, he was very undermining, he was very withholding. Ivana Trump, in her own memoir, described him as a brutal father. And everything that I have ever heard about him would suggest that's so, not emotional. It was interesting, though. I couldn't find anybody who said that Fred Trump criticized Donald Trump to them in public. It's always sort of private and behind the scenes. In public, it was always everything he touches turns to gold, and Fred Trump encouraged a pretty devastating competition between Donald Trump and his brother Freddie, and that also had a very long-lasting impact on Donald Trump.
And unfortunately on Fred as
well. And
well.
On Freddie, who died of alcoholism. So.
Yeah. Talking about influences, the other one that stands out is obviously Roy Cohn. You sort of made his name in the McCarthy hearings, and then later obviously became Trump's lawyer. I mean, he was sort of Trump's Jiminy Cricket in many ways. Tell us a little bit about the relationship and what Trump learned from Roy Cohn.
Sure. So Cohn starts representing the Trumps when they get sued by the Justice Department for allegedly racially discriminatory housing practices. The Trumps end up signing a consent decree, although it's, the Trumps countersued on the advice of Roy Cohn. And Donald Trump would constantly say there was no admission of wrongdoing, and that was, which is something that he says all the time when he is forced to settle. Cohn, I think was an avatar for Trump. I think in some ways a sort of a favored protector and a model that he sought out. But Cohn was also, he was more than that. He was, and I talk about this in the book, that, he treated being a lawyer as if it was something different than that. It was, mafia don. It was power broker. Everything was a transaction, and everything could be traded, and nothing was set in stone, and everybody could be corrupted, just, either a tiny bit or a lot. And he was constantly menacing and threatening and thuggish.
But it worked. It often worked.
It often worked, and all of those were, or at least to a point, and all of those were lessons that Trump took and liked and incorporated into his persona. And then spent the rest of his days, once Cohn was no longer able to be effective for him, and Cohn died of AIDS. Cohn, who was a gay man who was deeply homophobic and helped lead purges of the federal government of gay workers. When he got AIDS, Trump started distancing himself from Cohn. And Cohn's assistant said to me and my colleague Matt Flegenheimer in 2016 when we went to go see her in Long Island, she's passed away since, about Trump, when he dumped him, meaning he dumped Roy. And Cohn, and this is in Wayne's book, was really devastated by it and said, I can't believe he's doing this to me. but he was no exception, except that Trump, who distances himself and kind of turns his back, on Cohn when he's at his lowest, then spends the rest of his days trying to replicate Roy Cohn.
Yeah, and I think we see echoes of Cohn all the way through the White House.
Yeah.
You made a really good point that maybe more than anything else, Trump was a tabloid celebrity. We, covering politics, would always roll our eyes when we'd hear, hey, Donald Trump is thinking about running for mayor or governor or president. He flirted for a long time. It was sort of like Charlie Brown with a football, and then as we in the political media, and then he'd pull it back and he wouldn't run. So what do you think made him decide to hold on to the football and run in 2016 after so many fake outs?
Yeah, I'll tell you. I just want to add one thing to the Roy Cohn point. The other thing about Roy Cohn that Trump learned was how sort of it's what Marie Brenner called the favor economy of New York works. I mean, Roy Cohn was known for being close with Nancy Reagan, and he was known for having all kinds of relationships all over town with powerful people, and he learned some of that from Fred too, on sort of the more machine politics end. And Cohn was obviously involved in that as well. But Cohn was much more of sort of a celebrity seeker in a different way, and a status seeker at a much higher level. And that was a lot of what Trump tried to do, was develop sort of relationships with powerful people and make himself a commodity in that way. It wasn't just a tabloid celebrity. I mean, he was all over various television stations. He was on the pages of the New York Times. I mean, he brick by brick, and the bricks were news stories, built this artifice of Donald Trump, titan of industry. And by the time it was clear to people in New York City that that wasn't the case, across the country, his reputation was already.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions. That we'll get to why he ran in 2016 in a second. But how much of his empire was real, and how much of it was like pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, that it was a paper empire?
There were pieces that were real. He built Trump Tower. He built or finished construction on 3 casinos. There's not a ton of brick and mortar with him. Trump Tower was an example. But he was constantly overstating his net worth. He was posing as a publicist to get on the Forbes wealthiest list. It was so much of him. It's like what I said about his political base right now. It's not nothing. It's just not what he says it is, right? Or it's not nothing, but it's not what it was. There was a time where he was doing much better in the 1980s, but he was, and he's also, it's important to remember, he is actually richer than the majority of Americans, right? I mean, it's like, even though he's not as rich as he has always said he is, based on everything we've ever heard, and based on his own tax returns, he is still very rich. And so he's able to kind of travel in certain circles and portray an image. But once it popped, he overborrowed, he was overleveraged, and once it popped, he was never able to be the same. But the image of him was so baked nationally.
And his name was licensed out. Even though he didn't own property, his name would be. And
that came later,
right,
that he started getting into the licensing game. But you're right, that people couldn't tell the difference between his name is on a property and that he doesn't own it. He's just lending his name. And then he's able to point to, I have this building, I have this building. So it's some mix of smoke and reality.
So he has his name on all these buildings. He's on The Apprentice, does all these fake outs with us. Why did he decide to finally actually run?
I think a couple of reasons. He was bored, really bored by his business. He was much older at that point. He was already, by the time the 2016 campaign came to a close, he was 70. There were not going to be a ton more chances. This was an open seat. Whoever won in that race, if it wasn't him, was potentially going to serve for 8 years. He's not going to start running for the first time. And it's important to remember, I mean, yes, the Lucy with the football thing, I think, accurately describes how a lot of us, including me, felt in 2011 when he was looking at running and raised his poll numbers on the birth or lie, and then abandoned it all during sweeps week, right? I mean, it was like, oh, okay. But this is somebody who first started talking about running for president as far back as 1980. He first started, fooling around about it in a real public way in 1987. And, you don't think about something for that long, and it's not all publicity. This is something.
See, I always incorrectly, obviously, viewed it, oh, this is just to get his name out there.
No, I mean, that was a benefit too, but he also, has an enormous ego, and as does everybody who runs for president, and he believed that he could do it. And he also, there's this moment I write about in the book where in the 1998 convention in New Orleans, he goes, which is where H.W. is being nominated, and he's being
88.
In 88.
Yeah.
Did I say 98?
Yeah.
I meant 88. He's being squired by an associate of Roger Stone, and they're on the floor, and Trump looks up and he sees the balloons all netted to the ceiling, and the bunting is everywhere, and he says to himself, but the associate hears it, "This is what I want," and that is what he wants. So I think that the hour was getting late, and he ran.
He is many things before becoming president, but one of them he certainly was not, was a bona fide conservative politically. But if you look at his 4 years in office, he pushed many policies, particularly when it comes to the federal judiciary, that I would say make him one of the most conservative presidents in modern history. How did this happen?
So he was always much more conservative than I think people realized. Remember, this is a guy who writes an op-ed in the 1980s condemning a bunch of teenagers to the death penalty over the Central Park jogger case when they hadn't even been charged, or at least, hadn't been tried. He has this whole law and order obsession. He's in that ad where it's bring back the death penalty, bring back our police, which is an ad he took out in the daily newspapers, or a bunch of them. He tells this anecdote that who knows if it was even true, but it was all about being in a diner with his father, and some people were being difficult, and some cops came in and threw them out the door, and that's how they should be able to do it. I mean, that's not typically what you hear from sort of New York political circles, and so, a lot of average New York voters who live on Fifth Avenue. This is always who he's been. His father was very conservative, and so it's not a total surprise. He took a lot of political positions in 1999 in this book that he did that was basically thought out by Roger Stone. It was in advance of possibly running on the Reform Party line. It was ghostwritten by a guy named Dave Shiflett, who met with Trump for an hour and 45 minutes, and then that was the only haul that he got out of him, and then he writes the book. But it wedded Trump to a bunch of actually pretty progressive policies that I don't think Trump remotely supported at that point. On health care, on abortion. Now, I do think Trump was pro-abortion rights for a while, and then he was not in order to get the nomination, or, I mean, he says it was a legitimate conversion. It happened to coincide with 2011 when he was looking at running. But Trump does not have a fixed ideology. I mean, he is really...
that's my point.
Yeah.
And yet, if I was, running CPAC, he was the winner of the straw poll.
He was the winner of the straw poll because he took a lot of positions on issues, including immigration, which, by the way, he didn't even talk about in 2011. But by 2014 midterms, it was very clear that immigration was a huge driving issue for voters, and he was willing to be led by a bunch of consultants, one of whom was Stephen Miller, who is an immigration hardliner, and Steve Bannon, who is an immigration hardliner, and he just sort of echoed this stuff, and so he has taken, you are correct, an incredibly hardline number of positions on any number of issues, but it's unrecognizable to people who knew him in the 1980s.
Yeah, and he could read the room, and I think that's
correct. That's what it is, and he knew what he had to do. If you envision where Donald Trump falls on anything, think of somebody standing on stage and looking at how the crowd's reacting, and then doing more of how the crowd's reacting. And the crowd was that 25% sliver of the Republican Party that he had in 2015 into the first, into the Iowa caucuses and the first primaries, and then into Super Tuesday. And he was just going to do more and more and more and more. There was a point in the middle of his presidency when it looked like Bernie Sanders was going to be the nominee, or could be. And he starts telling advisors, we have to work on things to give away free stuff. That was the words, free stuff. And so, this is not, there's not some firm core there. He has a couple of id-like impulses on issues like trade. He was pretty consistent on that over decades, but generally speaking, and the countries are ripping us off. He just sort of changed which country.
And there's some Democrats who would agree with a lot of his trade.
When Trump got elected, you know, a lot of Democrats who were in Congress were very concerned about where he was on China, where he was on trade. They were concerned that he was going to govern, you know, further to the left than he had campaigned. And of course, that's not always what we saw, but that there was a reason for it, because there were some issues that had resonance in both wings.
You know, talking about reading his room, I always thought that if Trump tried to approach COVID as if it were a war, and he's a wartime president, that he could have made it a winning political issue. But instead, as we all know, he initially embraced some of the policies pushed by health professionals, and then tried to put COVID under the rug. He rejected that more and more. Did COVID, do you think, was it the main reason that cost him his presidency?
You know, it's very hard in a race that, while Biden won decisively at the popular vote level, it was settled by about 40,000 votes in 3 states. It's very hard at the Electoral College level. It's hard to tell with that close a race. You know, here's the thing.
Right.
There's obviously a number of factors. But it was certainly a factor, and I think not a small one. You know, it's, as you correctly say, most elected officials, when they have a crisis, they tend to try to do what they can to make that crisis politically beneficial. And
W. Bush, for example.
W. Bush, or, I mean, I can go down the list, but, you know, Chris Christie during Hurricane Sandy, the President Obama, frankly, at the end of the 2012 election, showing up on the East Coast during Hurricane Sandy. It's just not in him, and he, you know, he saw the economy tanking. He saw, and that's really, you know, the stock market was his personal pole. And then he had, again, to my point about how he doesn't actually really have that much of a natural inclination for, you know, this is where my base will be. It really is, you know, show me where my people are so I can lead them. And so he had people in his ear, you know, some of his hardline advisors, telling him the COVID mandates are bad, your supporters don't like them.
The second part is definitely true. His supporters, right?
Yeah, his supporters don't like them. Yeah, but he's cosseted in the White House at that point, has no real sense of it. You know, a lot of people were discouraging him on pushing, you know, an aggressive vaccine path. It's not as if the pharmaceutical industry was going to sit back and not try to find a vaccine, but he did put a lot of energy and some money behind it. But you know, he just seemed sort of lost by the entire thing.
Even when he caught it.
Well, when he caught it was, I mean, that was a sort of remarkable.
So
Bob's getting a call.
By dinner order.
Yeah, he's just, his Uber is here.
Good night.
When he caught it was another moment that he frankly could have used. Some of his advisors, and I write about this in the book, wanted him to do an ad that was basically like, I got COVID. And there are administration health officials who believe if he had not gotten the monoclonal antibody treatment, that he would have died. That's how sick he was. And that he could have filmed an ad saying, you know, I had this, there could have been something emotional, reaching out to people. He wouldn't do it.
I want to turn this to the floor in a second, but I want to get to 1/6 before January 6th,
Mm-hmm.
before that. I remember on the first day of the RNC, in the Republican convention in 2020, this was before the convention actually started. He spoke with delegates at an event, and he's like, I'm going to win, and the only way I'm going to lose is if it's rigged.
Right.
And I was sort of stunned at the time. This was like before, this is like in August. And this obviously was part of the argument then and ever since. So I'm asking you, I guess, to go inside his head, which isn't entirely fair, but do you genuinely believe, do you think that he genuinely believes the election was stolen, or is this just a long spin game?
So you're right, I can't get in his head.
Right.
I don't know if he actually believes that the election was stolen, although he is very good at telling himself the same thing over and over again, or saying the same thing over and over again until it starts to seem like it's true. What I will point to is he said the election that he won was rigged, the 2016 election. He went on and on about how that was rigged. You know, that there were millions of undocumented voters bussed into New Hampshire and this and that, and you know, he says a version of this to the congressional leaders at his first meeting with them at the White House, and Pelosi says, I don't think so, Mr. President. You know, so he was warning even before that election that it was all going to be, you know, quote unquote, stolen in Philadelphia, and he just happened, I'm sure by coincidence, to be picking predominantly black urban areas. And so, everything is always rigged if it's not for him, and he lays the groundwork ahead of time, and we have seen him do this over and over again. So I don't know I don't know whether he believes it, and I don't really know that it matters, I think, potentially legally if he were to get charged.
Right.
Because I think that's where it would become, a claim that you actually believed something, therefore you're not knowingly perpetrating a fraud. In terms of the effect of what he says and how destructive the language is,
It's the same.
it doesn't matter. And what it reminds me of, just to go back to where we began with the retribution question, the speech this weekend was one of the darkest speeches I have ever heard him give, and I've heard him give a lot of speeches. The way in which he delivered this line, and for those who didn't hear the speech, he said, in 2016, I said I was your voice. Now I'm telling you I am your warrior, I am your justice. And for those of you who have been wronged or betrayed, I am your retribution. And then he says the line again, I'm your retribution. And he says it in this almost sing-song way, as if he's like reading the lines for the first time. I'm your retribution.
Well, what does he mean?
Well, what his people say he meant is, he's defending the forgotten man. What the majority of people I spoke to took it as is he is showing you what a second term is going to be like, and that second term would be entirely a term of spite, and it would be about payback, and it would be about fixing what he thinks was done to him. And it's important to remember how much of the first presidency was about that. And it almost gets lost because there was so much chaos and so much going on every day that it's only now that we're learning more things. Jeff Berman, the former Southern District prosecutor, wrote a book where he laid out very clearly the efforts to politicize the Justice Department and to have Berman prosecute political enemies of Trump. Other people who have worked for Trump have described him trying to weaponize government. That was before he felt as wronged as he does now. So, it was very stark.
So this will not be Grover Cleveland's second term.
This is
in other words, if we
something
get
very
him.
different.
We have forgotten men and women in the audience who I want to give them a chance to ask a question. Let me just give an example about asking a question. What's your favorite color?
I don't want to answer that question.
Okay. What's your favorite food?
I don't want to answer that
Okay.
question.
So these are questions. These are actual questions. I'm trying to ask Maggie a question. I am not going to. The question cannot be. Let me tell you why my favorite color is yellow. So please, I want you to ask a question and not tell a question to Maggie. And I see someone over there. Please,
Maggie,
ask
you
away.
were able to get Trump to talk to you many times. If he runs again, do you expect him to reach out to you? Are you trying to make contact with him? And what are the chances that he'll talk to you again?
I mean,
When was the last time you talked to him?
I haven't talked to him since, it's a fair question. I haven't talked to him since September 2021, which was my last book interview, because in the intervening months, a few months later, I reported that he had been flushing documents down the toilets at the White House, and he didn't like that reporting, and he put out a statement calling me a maggot. So I haven't talked to him. He has sent me cryptic messages through people, but he can't. I have not reached out to ask to talk to him, and I don't anticipate doing that. If there's a story that we need a comment from him on, I will absolutely ask for a comment because he's somebody who we're covering. But his thing with me is really about the New York Times, and and we didn't talk about this, but he is uniquely obsessed with the New York Times, still to this day. I think 4 of his posts on his social media site, Truth Social, which has vastly fewer followers than Twitter, but have been about the New York Times in the last 2 days, so including one on my reporting. So I anticipate he will make himself heard one way or the other.
It's the ultimate establishment.
Right.
Please.
Yes. One of Trump's college professors said he was the stupidest student he had ever had. And also there are rumors that he can't read. Other than Stephen Miller and Stephen Bannon, who really took Goebbels and Nazism to, establish his media and his we versus them, do you think he thinks any of these things on his own, or without them, he would have never made it?
It's a good question, and just in terms of how much he takes from suggestion from aides. He can read. He just, doesn't that often. But if it's not a news story or something he's seeing online, and he did not read the briefing books when he was president. He didn't read his president's daily brief. Much of what he has said as president has come from someone else. As I said, he has a couple of fixed id-like impulses on issues like trade. So tariffs were probably something that he would have done on his own. But the wall, some of his more draconian border moves, those are generally being driven by other people, and he's a conduit.
Sir.
Could you talk a little bit, Ms. Haberman, about what you learned from your father about being a journalist?
It's a nice question. A lot. I mean, my father is, my father is still working to this day.
Clyde Haberman.
Clyde Haberman, who was a columnist in New York for a very long time at the Times. He had an incredibly long career at the Times. He was a foreign correspondent. He was a City Hall bureau chief. My father has a tremendous sense of fairness, but he also, he really doesn't like being lied to. And he's very, very dogged. And I remember him saying to me when I was much younger, we were watching the movie The Year of Living Dangerously. And the movie ends, and I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't seen it, but it doesn't end happily, and B, it's
a great movie.
It's a great movie, but it ends with essentially it ends with the journalist leaving a major story. And my father said, "This is not realistic." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because no real journalist would ever leave the story." And I think that's probably the biggest lesson that I've taken from him, which is also probably why I'm still stuck on this beat. But he is, he is, and he's an incredible teacher, and he's also, he's very generous. We talked about Jack and we talked about Wayne, but there are so many of my colleagues at the paper who worked with my father and who talk about what he taught them and how kind he was to them when he didn't need to be and he had no reason to be. All of those are things I learned from him too.
I never have asked you this. Did your father ever say, "Don't do journalism, this is crazy," or did he say, "Do it"?
He never said either one of those.
Right.
It just wasn't a conversation.
Right.
So.
Sir.
Thanks. I think in the book you said that Trump is smarter than his critics would suggest.
Shrewd.
I'm wondering if you can elaborate what you think Trump is actually good at or skilled at.
If there's anything I think he's skilled at or good at, I think he's a very effective salesman. And I think that if you look at, the things that he has been able to get people to buy into, or the fact that he convinced banks to let him stay afloat in the early 1990s, or the fact that he got himself elected president. And, regardless of various other things happening in the 2016 campaign cycle, he created an image of himself. He was aided enormously by his father in ways the public did not see. And he was, constantly saying things to the press that were not true and that should not have made their way into publication, and often did. But he is a very effective salesman.
Thanks.
Ma'am.
I just want to say thank you for your reporting and your insights, and that gave glimpses of hope when I really needed them. What does Putin have on Trump?
I don't even know how to answer that. I mean, a lot of questions, other than just to say that it gets asked a lot why Trump is so praising of Putin and has been historically, and there's obviously been many people asking questions like what you asked, asking if there's some kind of a financial issue. There's also the fact that Trump really just likes authoritarians.
I was going to say, there's others.
Yeah.
Erdogan.
Yeah, he's praised Erdogan. He's praised Kim Jong-un. He's frankly a little heavily focused on his relationship with Kim Jong-un. He's got pictures of himself with him from his presidency on his post-presidential office walls. So, it's just who he is. One thing I just want to point out is that he gave this interview to Playboy magazine in 1990, and much of it was about sort of who he was, and it was, you know, Donald in the middle of this storm and everything that was going on. But in the middle of that interview, he starts praising the crackdown on the Tiananmen Square protests. Wow. And, you know, says this is a real show of strength. So what I would say is, and I try to show this in the book, this is who he always is. And I don't think that anything that he is saying or says is, you know, part of the point of the book is not just the origins and the influences, but the consistency in terms of certain behaviors. So.
Sir.
Hello. I don't know if you would want to answer this question, but I'll ask it anyway. You're considered one of the foremost chroniclers of Trump and Trumpism. Do you like or dislike the man? Or do you consider yourself an objective observer, like a scientist, and you're just observing him? And my question is, put on my glasses. If you don't have feelings one way or the other about him, because you need to be objective in your profession, how do you balance between being a truth teller and also maintaining access to him for future publications?
I just said I haven't talked to him since September 2021, so maintaining access to him has never been a concern of mine, either prior to this book, since this book. I'm here to just report on what's in front of me. And you know, I know a lot of people around him. I know a lot of people who work for him. I know a lot of people in his government, and I know a lot of Republicans. So I've been able to get information, but my goal is to get information. My goal is not to get Donald Trump on the phone. And in terms of just objectivity, I do think I'm objective, and I do think I'm fair, but sometimes the fact sets are not fact sets he likes, and that's just the way it goes.
And one other thing, you said you can't get into his head, but what about getting into his heart?
I can't get there either.
I was thinking, you know, Biden, whatever things he may be lacking, he's very empathetic and compassionate. And one thing about Trump, and maybe it's with his family or his relationship with Barron as a father, I mean, I don't see any empathy or compassion from him. So I just wonder if he's just a personification of evil. I mean, do you have any insight in that?
I think you've asked me 3 questions, so I think I'm good. Thank you.
You know, we should have a full disclosure moment. You touched on it, but we should, like, for the audience, what investigations is he currently facing right now?
It's a good question.
Because, like, that hangs over all his political
No,
questions.
it's a good question. So he is facing an investigation by the Manhattan District Attorney, Alvin Bragg, that is pretty advanced at this point, related to hush money payments that were made in October 2016 by Michael Cohen, his former fixer and lawyer and, you know, version of Roy Cohn, to an adult film actress named Stormy Daniels, who claimed to have had an affair with him with Trump a decade earlier. If that investigation proceeds to a charge, it will not be a campaign finance charge, because that would be a federal charge, because he was running for federal office. It would be some kind of business filing charge. So that's one, but that investigation has progressed pretty quickly. Then there's the investigation in Fulton County, Georgia, which is being run by the District Attorney, Fani Willis. They just had a fact-finding grand jury. And you all may have seen interviews with a jury forewoman who was talking a lot. That's not a charging grand jury. They issued a report, they made recommendations. They recommended that multiple people should be charged. We don't know who they are. And so Fani Willis, who's a very aggressive prosecutor, especially on using RICO as a statute, is going to have decisions to make in the next couple of months, from now probably till May. Then there are 2 investigations that are being overseen by Jack Smith, who is a former assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of New York, he was there when I covered that courthouse. As a side note, the chief judge at the time when I covered that courthouse was the first prosecutor to investigate Donald Trump in the late 1970s, because New York is 2 people big. And that case, those 2 cases, one relates to January 6th and Trump's efforts to stay in power more broadly, and there's a special focus on the so-called fake electors, where there was this plot by the Trump campaign or aspects of the Trump campaign to seat a bunch of electors who would be committed to Trump when the Electoral College was voted on, or certified, I should say, on January 6th. That's what was taking place when the attack on the Capitol happened. The other investigation, if you're still with me.
Like a chart here.
I know.
You know, like-
If you're still with me, the other investigation is into Trump's retention of hundreds of pages of classified material at Mar-a-Lago after he left the White House, and other presidential records material that the Justice Department had tried getting back over, first the National Archives, then the Justice Department, over many, many, many months. There was a grand jury subpoena. His lawyer wrote a statement saying a diligent search had been conducted and they found everything and had complied with the subpoena. Justice Department developed information that that was not the case, and the FBI executed a search warrant on Mar-a-Lago in August of 2022. So all of those are the investigations that we know he is facing.
Right, and then, to your point.
There could be
as
others,
well.
but that's what we know of.
I think we have, I don't know if there's anyone with, I was gonna say, I think we have time for one final question, if anyone has any more questions, or everyone's questions about Donald Trump forever answered, the audience. Well, thank you all very much. I want to thank Mac and Jennifer, Rob, and everyone.
Thanks,
It's been a
guys.
terrific night. Thank you.